Association of New South Wales. What we've witnessed in the last 24 hours, the events up at Carryong last night, illustrate perfectly that we have a juvenile justice system that has descended into chaos. I cannot underestimate the events that have occurred up there are nothing short of horrific. You've had a situation where upwards of 30 of those detainees have obtained control of that centre. They have then turned around and sought to go after known sex offenders. They have targeted those offenders. They have set about, as we understand, with the intent to either murder those offenders or do very, very serious harm to those offenders. A number of those detainees are currently sitting in intensive care with stab wounds to the chest and serious head injuries. It is only by the grace of God that there was not a fatality on either one of our members or indeed on a fellow detainee. Now, this is a situation that has been occurring for a number of years. This is a situation that arose once the government sought to hand the Carryong facility back over to the adult system. It meant that the department effectively had no means of dealing with violent offenders. Make no mistake, we have offenders in there up to the age of 21, some of whom have been charged with murder, with terror-related offences and with some horrific sex crimes. It is not good enough for the government to continue to drag their heels. We have been begging this government to introduce specialised facilities in each centre, therapeutic units that could bring intensive staffing and intensive programs to bear on repeat offenders. Indeed, it's only a matter of weeks ago whereby they started to send 18-year-old plus detainees off to the adult facilities where they committed violent acts. Twice this year, earlier this year in January and again earlier in June of this year, our members have had to walk off the job statewide to try to protest their safety, and the government continue to drag their heels. Well, we are calling for a judicial inquiry into the juvenile system. We need to give our members powers similar to corrective services, indeed similar to other frontline agencies, to deal with these types of situations and to deal with juvenile offenders. The government must also act to ensure that they introduce segregated facilities for known sex offenders. I'll ask Troy Wright, the Assistant Secretary, if you'd like to add anything to that, and then we'll take questions.
Thanks, Stuart. Thanks for being here. Firstly, we need to recognise this is an ongoing situation. Our thoughts should be at this time with the police and the youth officers who are currently trying to contain what was an extremely volatile situation overnight. Secondly, as Stuart said, this needs to be recognised as not an isolated incident. There was a similar riot at the same centre, Frank Baxter, only on the June weekend. Some months before that, there was a similar riot where more than $100,000 worth of damage was done at the centre at Arana, at Dubbo. And coupled with that, over the previous weeks, months and even years, we have seen escalating assaults on our members in youth centres across the state. These events, as serious as they are overnight, are symptoms of a problem and not the problem themselves. The problem is the system is becoming increasingly violent for detainees, increasingly violent for our staff, for our members, and more so, we have a minister who seems bereft of ideas of how to address it. It is only, as Stuart said, it is only dumb luck and not good planning that one of these incidents hasn't resulted in even more serious injury or death. What we have been calling on the government to do is threefold. Firstly, as Stuart said, for 3 years, we've been calling on the government to implement what we refer to as a high-risk management unit that can address the offending behaviour of the most serious violent detainees in the system. We've been asking for that for 3 years. We were given an interim solution only 7 weeks ago following the last incident at Frank Baxter, but as yet nothing's happened. The system needs reform, the system needs money. We were extremely disappointed in the state budget only a few weeks ago that not one additional dollar has been put towards the juvenile justice system, which is irrefutably now in crisis. The second thing we're calling on the government to do and the department to do immediately is some sort of safety audit. We know overnight that the detainees that managed to get keys accessed a maintenance shed and from there became weaponised with garden tools, hedge trimmers, things like that. This comes in addition to, we had a member at Dubbo assaulted a few weeks ago with a hammer, and last year we had a member assaulted with a fire extinguisher. It is clear that not just from a staffing level, but from a physical, what is available in the centre needs to be completely reviewed, completely looked at, and looked at through a safety lens, because right now there are too many items in the detention centres that can be used as weapons. The third thing we're calling for, as Stuart said, is a judicial review of the powers and the functions of the entire system. What we hear from our members is this is a system that is heavy on rewards and light on consequences. We are hearing it repeatedly. We need involvement from the staff in the case management process. We need legislative reform similar to that has occurred in the adult system in response to the Hamsey case. And we need a systematic review of the classification and the placement of offenders across the system. Thank you.
Any questions?
Just with the motive for all this, you said that the inmates were targeting sex offenders.
That's right.
Other people that are injured, have they been either collateral damage or have they been specifically targeted?
They've been. Look, my understanding is, and again, this comes down to a serious failure by management to have, if you like, known sex offenders, where we know from the adult system that you segregate those types of offenders because they are at risk when they're anywhere near the general population. Our understanding is that they have been specifically targeted. Indeed, you had a situation where these offenders, they had the keys to the facility. Troy said they accessed a garden shed. How on earth do we have power tools inside a facility like that? I mean, it beggars belief. They've accessed power tools, a hedge trimmer or something like that, and they've then set upon these known sex offenders who should never have been housed in that facility near them. It is a complete failure of management and it's a failure of the system.
And with the, obviously it seems that there have been some kind of coordination because it appears that perhaps some inmates have either cornered or trapped an officer there to be able to get the keys.
Yes.
Does it seem that the people that can carry this out, they will sort of regulate this? What kind of coordination does it seem to have taken place?
We'll have to see where the inquiries go, but as we've said, there's been an escalation of this violent behaviour. And again, it's because there's no consequences for when any of these detainees commit a violent act, particularly if they're below the age of 18. It just seems to us that this has been slowly escalating now for some time. Look, we're not sure as to what planning went into this. Certainly it's the case that upward of 30 of these detainees were then ran riot, accessing power tools. Upwards of 18 of them scaled the roof. Indeed, the police are still in negotiation to get some of those people down now.
Maybe mention about further consequences for some of these offenders. If we look at the adult system, they might go to solitary confinement, there might be privileges taken away. What specifically do you mean when you talk about like you see consequences for
Well, basic human behaviour is that you reward good behaviour and you punish bad behaviour. If someone spits blood into the face of an officer, we don't expect to see that offender put on a truck and sent to another facility where they do the same thing. What we would expect is for that person to be placed into some type of segregation and dealt with in a therapeutic means, whereby they must undergo violent offender training and programs, and they don't progress until such time as they complete them. They haven't had to do that now for 3 or 4 years. A complete failure by the government in that period. They must introduce these high-risk units as a matter of urgency. Indeed, it may be too late for that, we don't know. But they have to act, and they have to act today.
It's hard to imagine adult prisoners getting their hands on power tools and that kind of thing. Is it the case that juvenile centres need a more mature approach with regards?
The answer to that's no. For heaven forbid me, I've been to Frank Baxter. Why on earth would you house those types of tools inside a facility? Wouldn't you put them outside? I mean, it is just beggars belief that they've been able to access those types of implements. Again, we don't know exactly what they've done with them. But as Troy said, we had a member bashed in the head with a hammer a few weeks ago. I mean, again, it's just a failure of management over a number of years to adequately oversee the system. There's been a complete lack of proper legislative powers in place for our members to deal with these high-risk offenders.
Have any staff or paramedics been injured in the incident?
Back in front? Sorry. Look, staff, thankfully our staff were able to retreat where they call police. They have to do that because they don't have the powers or the training or the facilities as we do in the correctional system, in the adult system, to deal with this type of situation. As I understand it, there haven't been any serious injuries in this event, but over the last 3 years, injuries on our members have more than quadrupled. We have 25 members at that one facility off on workers' compensation. I had a member up there who I visited in the hospital who had the large bone in his leg broken in a wrestle with an inmate. Fractured eye sockets. The psychological injuries up there are horrific, and yet the government continues to fail to act. What will it take for them to act? What will it take for Minister Ward, or indeed for the Premier, to come out and bring this situation under control? Not inside. I mean, certainly you'd never arm anyone inside a facility, but you would have to look at what appointments you can give to these types of officers, what type of training. Again, we've called for a judicial review to look into that. Certainly it's the case within the adult system that they have those types of appointments and that they can deal with it. Now, the reality is that the police have had to attend. They've deployed gas. They've had to deploy gas. They've had to bring other types of implements to bear. They've got no option but to do that. So surely we need to look at all of those options.
Have you been told how long it took for police to arrive at the facility? Was there an extensive period of time?
No, look, my understanding is that they were able to get there fairly quickly, but understand they would have to then coordinate their riot squad. I'm not clear whether they've called in the state emergency services from corrective services. It would take time, but they do have contingency planning for that.
And you mentioned the guards were they behind a barrier or in another room, or how did they see?
They would be trained to remove themselves into a safe area and wait for the arrival of the police. Thanks, guys. Ta.